The first time I laid eyes on the Bluefin Diner, it was exactly the kind of place you'd expect to find in a wasteland like this. Route 66 stretched out in front of me, a lonely strip of asphalt cutting through the barren desert. The air shimmered under the unrelenting afternoon sun, and the landscape offered little more than dry, cracked earth and the occasional cactus to break up the monotony. It was the sort of emptiness that made you feel small, like just another speck in the vastness of nowhere. I'd been wandering for weeks, drifting from one small town to the next with nothing but an old duffel bag and a hollow ache in my chest that felt like it would never leave. Losing my job had been bad enough, but falling out with the few friends I had made it worse. I was left with nothing, no ties, no purpose. Every night, I'd stare at the ceilings of cheap motels, my thoughts swirling with doubts about whether I'd ever find a place where I belonged. I had no family to turn to, no home to go back to, and nowhere to stay long enough to matter. I was like a ghost, moving through the world without leaving a trace, waiting for something, anything, to give me a reason to stop running. When I pulled into the diner's parking lot, there wasn't another soul in sight. Just a weathered old sign swinging on a single rusty chain that said help wanted and a gas pump out front that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The diner itself was a relic, its paint cracked and peeling, the windows dusty and streaked. It was the kind of place that seemed to survive out of pure stubbornness. I sat there for a moment, staring at the sign. Maybe this was what I needed. I didn't have anywhere else to go, and the thought of having something to do, even if it was just scrubbing floors or flipping burgers, felt strangely comforting. After a deep breath, I stepped out of the car and headed for the door. The bell jingled softly as I pushed it open. Inside, the place was dim and worn down, with wallpaper peeling off the walls, cracked linoleum underfoot, and neon lights flickering overhead. The smell of grease and old coffee hung thick in the air, making my stomach twist a little. Behind the counter stood a man. His name tag said Earl, his face lined and weathered, his eyes hollow and distant. He didn't introduce himself, and from the way he looked at me, I doubted he ever would. I slid into a corner booth, the cracked vinyl seat sticking to my legs as I settled in. Earl's gaze stayed on me, sizing me up without a word, his expression impossible to read. After a moment, he shuffled over, notepad in hand. "What'll it be?" he asked, his voice rough and uninterested, like he'd been through this routine a million times before. I picked up the menu from the table. It was old, its pages yellowed and stained with coffee rings. The options were slim, and nothing looked particularly appetizing. "Just coffee," I said, forcing a small smile. He nodded without a word and walked back to the counter. The clunk of the coffee machine was the only sound in the otherwise silent diner. Outside, the neon sign buzzed faintly, throwing flickers of red and blue across the walls. It all felt a little eerie, like the place was stuck in time. When he returned, he set a chipped mug of coffee in front of me. I wrapped my hands around it, the warmth comforting even though the coffee itself tasted burnt and bitter. "Thanks," I mumbled, my voice barely above a whisper. He gave a slight nod and turned away, his footsteps echoing on the worn floor as he went back behind the counter. Even when he wasn't facing me, I couldn't shake the feeling he was still watching, like he was waiting for something. Clearing my throat, I glanced out the window at the sign hanging in the breeze. "You hiring?" I asked, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He turned back, his hollow eyes studying me again. After what felt like forever, he gave a slow nod, like he'd already guessed my question before I asked it. "You need a job?" His tone was flat, like he'd heard the same thing from countless people before and already knew how it would play out. I nodded. I needed the cash, enough to get me out of this town and onto the next, and maybe a little farther after that. Earl didn't ask me where I was from or why I'd ended up here. He just nodded again, a barely noticeable tilt of his head, as if he understood more about me than he was letting on. "All right," he said. "You start tonight." His voice was even, almost indifferent, but there was something in his tone I couldn't quite place. Pity, maybe, or just the kind of resignation that comes from being stuck in a place like this. Earl hesitated for a moment, then gave a slight jerk of his head, signaling me to follow. "Let me show you around," he said, his tone rough and edged with resignation, like he knew neither of us had many other options. I got up from the booth, the vinyl seat groaning under me, and trailed behind him as he led the way. Earl moved slow, pointing things out with a mechanical efficiency, his words coming out in a flat monotone. Counter, that's where you'll serve. Coffee machine, temperamental, but treat it right, and it'll do the job. Kitchen's back here. He pushed open a swinging door to reveal a dingy room crowded with battered pots and pans. He didn't waste words, just rattled off what I needed to know like he was checking items off a list. There was a weight to him, a deep exhaustion that seeped into every word and movement. He showed me the storage room, the restrooms, and even the back exit, his explanations clipped and impersonal. There wasn't a trace of warmth in his voice, no effort to make me feel comfortable, just the bare minimum. Like he'd done this 100 times and didn't expect me to stick around long. When we circled back to the front, he stopped by the door. That's it. Good luck, kid, he muttered. For a moment, his hollow eyes met mine. There was something there, unspoken but heavy, though I couldn't make sense of it. Then, without another word, he grabbed a worn coat from behind the counter and left, the bell above the door jingling softly as it closed behind him. I watched through the window as Earl disappeared into the night. There was something unsettling about the way he'd said good luck, like he meant it in a way I didn't fully understand. The diner felt emptier now, the stillness pressing in like a weight, but I pushed the feeling aside. I needed this job, even if it was just to keep me tethered to something for a while. I wandered the diner, taking in its worn-down charm, or lack of it. The wallpaper was peeling, the vinyl booths cracked, and the flickering neon lights cast strange, shifting shadows. The whole place had a kind of eerie loneliness, like it had been forgotten by time and the world. I ended up in the kitchen, a cramped, grimy room that reeked of stale grease and something faintly metallic. A leaky pipe dripped steadily in the corner, the sound echoing faintly. The floor creaked underfoot, and every surface looked like it hadn't been properly cleaned in years. Above the sink, a small window gave a view of the parking lot and, beyond that, a lake. It was the only thing breaking up the endless stretch of desert, a dark, still expanse of water that seemed to stretch forever, its surface eerily smooth. I settled behind the counter with a lukewarm cup of coffee, trying to stay awake as the hours dragged on. The silence of the diner felt oppressive, closing in around me. That's when I heard it, a soft, haunting melody drifting faintly through the air. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as it grew clearer, I realized it wasn't natural. The sound had a strange rhythm to it, almost beautiful, but unsettling in a way I couldn't explain. It tugged at me, like it was calling me, urging me to move. I glanced around the empty diner, trying to pinpoint the source, but it seemed to be coming from outside, near the lake. I moved to the window and peered out. The lake lay still, its surface like black glass reflecting the pale light of the moon. Something about it made my skin crawl, a sense of wrongness I couldn't shake. The melody grew louder, more insistent, and I found myself standing up, my feet moving toward the door almost on their own. My hand reached for the handle when I noticed something, a tear in one of the booth seats. Stuffed inside the gap was a crumpled piece of paper. Pulling it out, I unfolded the note. The handwriting was jagged and hurried, the edges of the paper torn and creased. It read, "Do not, under any circumstances, go near the lake. If you see wet footprints leading from the lake to the diner, clean them immediately with hot water. If you hear scratching on the windows, keep your eyes on your work. The diner lights must remain dim but never off." I stared at the words, a chill crawling down my spine. The note wasn't signed, but it felt real, too real to ignore. There were smudges on the paper, dark and dried, that looked too much like blood for comfort. I glanced back at the door. The melody still called to me, but I forced myself to sit back down, gripping the note tightly. Something about it made my gut twist, and I couldn't shake the feeling that ignoring its warning would be a mistake. As dawn broke, Earl returned, his hollow eyes flicking over me as he came in without a word. He looked even more drained than before, his expression unreadable. He didn't ask how my shift went, didn't seem to care if I'd noticed anything strange. I watched him for a moment, wondering what secrets he carried behind that tired face, but he didn't offer any answers. I headed back to my car, too wired to sleep but too exhausted to think straight. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were restless and dark, images of the lake pulling me under, the water cold and suffocating, the haunting melody echoing around me. I woke up with my heart pounding, the fear lingering long after I opened my eyes. It wasn't much, but a few hours of uneasy sleep were all I could manage before the next night began. The scratching stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence that felt louder than the noise had. My heart raced, and my hands trembled as I continued wiping down the counter, pretending to focus on the task in front of me. But my mind was elsewhere, every nerve in my body on high alert. Whatever was outside, it was still there. I could feel it, a presence lingering just beyond the diner's walls. Then the lights flickered. For a split second, the diner was plunged into darkness. My breath caught, and in the brief moment before the lights buzzed back on, I thought I saw a shape, a tall, distorted silhouette, standing outside the window. When the light returned, it was gone, replaced by the faint outline of smudges on the glass. Handprints, long, narrow fingers that ended in sharp, claw-like tips. I forced myself to keep my eyes down, focusing on the counter as I scrubbed the same spot over and over. My thoughts churned, trying to remember the rules. The lights, they must never go off. Rule 4. I glanced at the switches by the door, the fluorescent bulbs overhead buzzing faintly. The shadows felt heavier now, as though the room itself were closing in, suffocating me. I reached under the counter, fumbling for the emergency flashlight I had spotted earlier. My hands brushed against its cold metal frame, and I pulled it out, clutching it tightly. The small comfort it provided was fleeting, but it was enough to steady my breathing. The jukebox sputtered back to life. The warped melody returned, louder this time, the distorted notes filling the room like a siren's call. My grip on the flashlight tightened as I fought the urge to look around, to find the source of the unnatural energy that seemed to radiate from every corner of the diner. A sudden sound broke through the melody, a soft, wet squelching. I froze. It came again, closer this time, like something heavy and dripping was being dragged across the floor. My stomach churned as the sound grew louder, each wet slap against the tiles making my skin crawl. I dared a glance toward the back of the diner, my peripheral vision catching movement, a shadow slipping out of sight behind the kitchen door. No, I couldn't go back there. My body screamed at me to run, to leave this cursed place and never look back. But the thought of crossing the threshold into the open night terrified me even more. My fingers tightened around the flashlight, the cool metal grounding me. I needed to stay focused. I needed to survive this shift. The squelching stopped, replaced by a new sound. Breathing. Labored, wet breaths, as if whatever was in the diner was struggling to inhale. My chest tightened, the air around me feeling impossibly thick. The sound came from behind me now, just beyond the counter. I bit down on a scream, my knuckles white as I clutched the flashlight, my pulse thundering in my ears. Slowly, I turned my head, my movements sluggish as if weighed down by invisible chains. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure. Its body was humanoid but wrong. The skin glistened, slick with water that dripped onto the floor, pooling around its webbed feet. Its eyes were black voids, reflecting no light, and its elongated fingers twitched, tipped with claws that gleamed even in the dim glow of the diner lights. It stared at me, its head tilting unnaturally to one side as if studying me. The jukebox music warped further, the notes twisting into an ear-piercing cacophony that made my vision blur. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. The creature stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, each step accompanied by the wet slap of its feet against the floor. I didn't think. My hands moved on their own, fumbling with the flashlight as I turned it on and aimed it at the creature. The beam of light struck its face, and it let out a shriek, an inhuman, guttural cry that reverberated through the diner and shook me to my core. It recoiled, stumbling backward into the shadows, its form flickering like a mirage before disappearing entirely. The diner fell silent once more, save for the faint hum of the lights and the distant buzz of the neon sign outside. I collapsed against the counter, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. My hands were trembling so badly that I dropped the flashlight, the clatter echoing through the empty room. My eyes darted to the windows, half expecting to see the creature staring back at me, but there was only darkness. The rest of the night passed in a haze. I kept the flashlight close, my gaze fixed on the counter as I went through the motions of cleaning and organizing, anything to keep my mind occupied. Every sound, every flicker of movement in the corner of my vision sent a jolt of fear through me, but nothing else happened. The diner remained eerily still, as if holding its breath. When dawn finally broke, the pale light of the morning sun filtering through the windows, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The oppressive darkness lifted, replaced by a quiet stillness that felt almost peaceful. The door jingled as the owner walked in, his tired eyes scanning the room before settling on me. "You made it," he said, his tone flat but with a hint of surprise. He didn't ask what had happened, didn't seem to care about the terror I had endured. He simply handed me an envelope, his expression unreadable. "That's your pay. I suggest you don't stay in town too long." I didn't need to be told twice. Without another word, I grabbed my belongings and left the diner, stepping out into the cold morning air. As I walked to my car, I glanced back at the building, the neon sign now flickering weakly in the daylight. It looked ordinary, almost mundane, but I knew better. That place was anything but normal. As I drove away, the envelope sitting on the passenger seat, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure standing in the diner's doorway, but there was nothing. Only the empty road behind me, stretching into the horizon. I didn't stop driving until the diner was nothing more than a distant memory. But even now, as I write this, I can still hear the faint melody of the jukebox in the back of my mind, haunting and relentless. And I know, deep down, that I'll never truly escape that place. The jukebox went quiet just as abruptly as it had started, and the scratching ceased. The diner fell into an eerie silence, but I knew the danger hadn't passed. I let out a shaky breath, my heart still pounding in my chest. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure stood by the window, tall, gaunt, with matted hair that fell over a face obscured in shadow, except for its eyes. Those eyes gleamed through the glass, sharp and predatory, as though they could see straight through me. Its lips curled into a cruel, hollow smile, revealing teeth, jagged and sharp, too sharp, as if they were made to tear through something soft, fragile. My hands trembled as I gripped the counter, fighting the urge to look directly at it, to meet those eyes. But I could feel it, the creature's presence pulling me in. Its voice slithered into my mind, soft and seductive like a twisted lullaby, a hum that carried with it the weight of everything I tried to escape. It knew me. It whispered my name, my secrets, my regrets, each word laced with venom, each syllable twisting deeper into my mind. Just as I felt myself slipping, the door slammed open, the force knocking it against the wall and pulling me back into reality. The old man stood there, his eyes wide with terror, his face twisted in a panic I'd never seen before. He looked at me, and in that moment, I saw more fear in him than I had ever seen in anyone. His voice shook when he spoke. "Sorry, kid," he muttered, his words thick with guilt. "You weren't supposed to make it this far." Before I could react, he moved toward the window, his hands trembling as they reached for the latch. My heart sank, a cold, twisting feeling settling deep in my gut as I realized what was happening. He was letting it inside. 1,000 questions flashed through my mind. Why is he doing this? What will happen if he succeeds? I was powerless. My feet were glued to the floor as I watched him, helpless as the horror unfolded in front of me. The old man's fingers fumbled with the latch, and the creature's grin stretched wider, its sharp teeth gleaming, already tasting what was to come. My body went cold, my instincts screaming at me to run, to move. But I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped in place as the man turned back toward me, his face hollow with surrender. "I didn't want this," he whispered, his voice barely audible. But I had no choice. It keeps her satisfied. It keeps me safe. He swallowed, his voice breaking as he added, "But it's never enough." The weight of his words crashed into me. I was just another sacrifice, another pawn lured into this nightmare to save his wretched life. The disgust in my stomach churned, but there was no time to think. Behind him, the creature's long, dripping fingers curled over the window frame, trailing a dark, viscous liquid down the glass like ink. Panic surged through me. I had to stop him. I couldn't let whatever was coming inside. Desperate, I launched myself at the old man, colliding with him in a desperate attempt to prevent him from opening the window. He grunted, his eyes wild with a mixture of fury and fear as he shoved me back. "You don't understand," he shouted, his voice cracking with terror and anger. "You don't know what it will do." We struggled, crashing into tables and chairs, their metal legs scraping loudly against the floor. His hands, unexpectedly strong for his frail form, wrapped around my wrists, digging his nails into my skin. His breath was hot, ragged against my face as I fought to break free. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced over his shoulder. The creature was inside now, its body moving with a sickening fluidity, its pale, damp skin glistening in the dim light. Its mouth stretched wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, its eyes gleaming with an unmistakable hunger. With a surge of adrenaline, I twisted my body, managing to free one hand. My fingers scrambled across the counter until they grasped something cold and metallic, a kitchen knife. Without thinking, I drove it into the old man's side. He let out a strangled gasp, his grip loosening as shock and pain spread across his face. I shoved him away, his body stumbling backward toward the creature. The creature's eyes gleamed with savage delight as it reached out, its long, wet fingers curling around the old man's shoulders. He barely had time to scream before the creature sank its teeth into his neck, the sharp fangs tearing through flesh with a sickening crunch. His body went stiff, his eyes wide with pure terror as the creature dragged him to the floor, its teeth still embedded in his throat. Blood trailed behind them, dark and slick, leaving a gruesome path as the creature pulled him closer to the window. His screams rang out, a desperate, haunting sound that chilled me to my core. His eyes locked onto mine one last time, filled with a pleading, terrified look, but I couldn't help him. He was beyond saving. With a final, jerking motion, the creature yanked him through the window, its powerful grip tearing him from the diner. The old man's screams were abruptly cut off, leaving only the sound of the creature's rasping breath, mingled with the faint crunch of his body being dragged over gravel. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My heart was racing, pounding in my chest, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the open window. The wet sounds of the creature's feeding grew fainter, fading into the night. Without a second thought, I turned and bolted, my feet pounding against the linoleum as I threw open the front door and dashed into the cold night air, the terror and the nightmare hot on my heels. Outside, the world stretched before me, eerily quiet, as though the chaos I'd left behind hadn't yet reached it. The biting cold air stung my skin, snapping me out of the haze that still clouded my thoughts. Every step I took felt heavy, my body moving as if through water, trying to outrun the haunting images that clung to me. I stumbled toward the car, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel, starting the engine with a roar that seemed too loud in the silence. I pressed the gas pedal down, not caring where I was going, just needing to leave, to get away from that place, from what I had seen. I had made it out alive, but it didn't feel like a victory. Something inside me had broken. A part of me would always carry the weight of her whispers, echoing in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of the horrors waiting in the shadows. The darkness was never truly gone. It was still there, somewhere, beneath the surface of the lake, just out of sight.